European Renaissance. But in 1944, the great Renaissance scholar, I hate Claire Barr's work Volsky as much as I did, really kind of put paid to all this kind of thinking by demonstrating that just about everything that had been alleged by previous scholars to be an example of Chinese or Indian or other Asian influence in Renaissance art was entirely, or virtually entirely explicable in terms of native traditions. And really since then, no one has returned to the theory that the Renaissance must have been ignited in part by Chinese influence, except for this person. Of course, you know, Gavin Menzies has a history of threatening to sue people who disagree with him. I would love to be sued by him, but I don't want Benedictus or the University of Notre Dame to suffer this indignity. So I will not say that he is either a charlatan or an idiot, or probably both. I mean, obviously, you know, there's no evidence for any of this stuff that Menzies has made millions of pounds out of peddling. There was no direct Chinese voyages to Europe, or 90% of the other places that he claims in the 15th century. What there was, I mean, the culture outside the European heartland, Western European heartland, that clearly was in communication with European scholars and artists and thinkers in the Renaissance was that of Islam. And in recent years, scholarship has really focused on trying to assess the Islamic input into the Renaissance, and really, according to Islam, the role of, I don't know, the West kind of partner culture in creating all these great innovations. And you can see some of the evidence here. I mean, there are innumerable examples of these pseudo-Kufic inscriptions enhancing Renaissance paintings, especially of the Virgin. They're there, obviously, you know, to give an air of authenticity to the scene, because, you know, Arabic was a language which people in Western Europe associated with the Holy Land at the time. And I know scholars like my old friends Jared Cotton and Lisa Johnny, my former colleagues, have rather specialised in this line of inquiry. It's great work by Rosamund Mack, does show plenty of Islamic influences, especially in European urbanization in the Renaissance. Of course, ceramics is a really big area to look for if you want to find Islamic influence. It's an art which has a lot of interchange of personnel across the frontier between Christendom and Islam in the 15th century. Science, obviously, is a big area of inquiry too, although Saliba's book, which is probably the most well-known of the genre, is actually mainly about the 16th century, but you can certainly find Islamic influence in 15th century scientific, well, what we now call scientific work as well. We all know, you know, the examples of the interchange of artistic personnel across the same frontiers. This is Bellini's portrait of Mehmet the Conqueror. We now know that if Bellini didn't do this, it was Costanzo di Ferrara, but again, you know, this is a work that Costanzo made in Iran and that was copied by Iranian artists. So again, we've got this two-way cultural exchange going on in the 15th century. But I think even when you put all of these influences together, they don't explain what happened in Europe. They're really prominent in marginal areas of the arts and intellectual activity and culture. But they're not, I don't think they help us really understand why the Renaissance happened or why it was so popular in the rest of the world. Well, one way out of this dilemma is to deconstruct the Renaissance. And just, you know, to say, well, they're obvious. We can't explain it. It didn't happen. And of course, that's tremendously popular in the United States. I acquired an awful lot of obloquy at the Renaissance Society of America by suggesting that maybe this society was named after a real event that actually happened. But, you know, there's a lot of revisionist scholarship in recent years that certainly convinces us that the Renaissance wasn't what we used to think it was. And a lot of its, you know, a lot of traditional characteristics that people identified as being, you know, part of and indeed essential to the Renaissance were never really there. In these slides, I've kind of apostrophized some of the things that I said about the Renaissance, or rather I've apostrophized the conventional opinions and responded to them with things which I've said about the Renaissance and work of my own. I won't bore you by reading these out, but I think if I go through them, you can see how revisionism has eroded the traditional concept of what the Renaissance was. I think this is a really important point which people often overlook. That's tremendously important. You know, I remember being astonished when I was a schoolboy at the kind of art that the Medici patronized. You know, because it wasn't set on architectural or non-architectural scale. It wasn't typically classicizing. You know, it was well, Robert Lopez said it was investment. You know, clearly it was all about money and power. I think this is really important. The worship of Renaissance realism led people to undervalue the realism of a lot of Gothic and Romanesque painting and sculpture. This is really important because, you know, people got, I don't know, fascinated by the way Charles V makes Titian a count, or you know, the occasional artist is knighted by a patron who can't afford to pay him properly. This is nothing. You know, in the Middle Ages, you could become a saint by being an artist and glorifying God. As I say, you know, titles of nobility are derogations by comparison with sainthood. Which I hope Frau Duncan will agree with me about that. I don't think anybody's going to be surprised to see this now. I'm sure everybody realizes this. Again, the Greekness of the Renaissance has been outrageously exaggerated traditionally. The real, if you think the Renaissance has to be Greek, then the only Renaissance in Western history was in the 19th century. You know, that's the only time, and there were a lot of educated people who knew Greek. You know, if you look at medieval art, you see that people were always striving to imitate classical models when they could find them. It wasn't ambition that was lacking, it was the availability of sufficient models, I think, that caused departures from the classical tradition in the Middle Ages. Again, although, you know, I've made the point about landscape painting already, I do think it's worth remembering that although European art in the Middle Ages didn't depict landscapes without figures, it did increasingly depict landscapes with figures from the 13th century onwards. And I think the, you know, Franciscan devotion for nature as evidence of the glory of God is part of the reason for that. Well, I think we all know this is true. We happen to have in the audience a great expert on Giordano Bruno, so I'll defer to Professor Pallas on this one. This is one of my own little obsessions. You know, where does this sort of supposed Western individualism come from? The most individualistic literary tradition in the West is mysticism. Because it's when you've got, your personal hotline to God that you really become aware of yourself as an individual. Well, in order to explain, obviously, all of these revisionist glosses on the Renaissance don't succeed in reconstructing, in deconstructing it entirely. It's still there. It's not quite as we used to think, but it's still there, and it's still, only very marginally shaped by influences from outside Europe, and all of those influences seem to be Islamic. So where do we get to? If there's a link with China, where can we find it? Well, in order to make a suggestion about that, I take you to the last of my exotic locations in this lecture, which is the mausoleum of Kait Bey in Cairo. Because I think that records of Kait Bey's embassies to Europe provide us with a clue as to how Europeans knew about China in spite of the severance of Trans-Eurasian continents. Because there aren't, as far as I'm aware, not a lot of research has been done on the content of diplomatic gifts that crossed the frontier between Islam and Christendom in the 15th century. But there are a lot of records, fairly detailed records, of the gifts that Kait Bey sent to the European courts at which envoys of his represented. And they always include, by the standards of the day, quite substantial amounts of porcelain. I have to admit, I haven't found any records of books. But I suspect that books are typical diplomatic gifts in this period. I suspect that books of Chinese origin also reached European courts in this period. But the porcelain alone, which would be decorated in the same scenes and styles that one finds in Chinese painting and other media in the period, would provide European artists with models of Chinese art, even though no one was going from Europe to China anymore. So I think this seems to be the real route of intercultural communications via Islam and via diplomatic gifts. I think one can prove that in the case of Kait Bey, and I prepare some, the further searches will yield more records, more embassies, and enable us to build up a better picture of what Chinese objects, artifacts, and models were really available to European creators and innovators. Well, today, the world has returned to a state of intense intercommunication across Eurasia. We're in a new era of trans-Eurasian cultural exchange. Represented, I think, beginning in the 1950s with Niels Bohr's discovery of Chinese silence. This is the coat of arms that Niels Bohr received from the King of Denmark when he was made a Knight of the Order of the Elephant in 1953, I think it was. And you can see that he chose for his scutcheon the Taoist symbol, which represents, probably, I'm not sure whether you can read, it's not faint, but the motto that he gave himself when he became a knight was contraria sunt complementum. Contrary things are complementary. And this insight from Taoism was, of course, essential really to Boyle's account to himself of how quantum mechanics works. You might think of someone like this, J. Robert Oppenheimer, who took refuge from the guilt he felt at his role in devising the atom bomb by becoming immersed in Indian mysticism. Or I know, you might think of these guys, perhaps, in the 1960s. I think I was the only schoolboy of my generation not to go to India. So anything you hear in this lecture, ladies and gentlemen, is a result of retained objectivity. I spoiled it now. So obviously, the Tower of Pooh is another case in point. And if you want, evidence that Western values are again being forged by influences from China today, particularly if you want to think of aesthetics and art, the kinds of things we think of when we think of the Renaissance, naturally you will turn to the icon, the most representative icon of perfect beauty in Western culture today. There is, of course, Barbie, and there she is in her Chinese princess's outfit. So I don't know whether, as a result of these resumed trans-Eurasian contacts, we're in for another Renaissance. But if we are, I suspect it'll look a bit like that.
Felipe, that was amazing.
Well, I'll try and treat that as a compliment.
Amazingly interesting, entertaining, wide-ranging, and thought-provoking. I think everybody will agree.
Thank you very much. And may I have that in writing?
I'm particularly pleased to see that series of rebuttals of received wisdom about the Renaissance that you showed, because they were music to my own ears in my historical work. And particularly, I could go on at length about how much I agree with you, but I think that would be kind of boring.
No, it would be much more interesting to disagree. I think that obviously some of these suggestions are rather impish. I don't suppose everybody's instantly going to agree with that. I'd have to spend some time trying to persuade people. But I suppose most of these are based on revisionism, which is now familiar to anybody who really does know something about the subject. And what I think about these things is, because often people think that historical revisionism is a kind of perverse vice in which scholars engage in order to guarantee the perpetuation of their own jobs. Because obviously, if it turned out that previous generations of scholars were right, we could just send, our students to the Bouquinistes and Morin could sack me. So people often think, that historical revisionism is a kind of, a kind of professional vice. But it's not, it's all about trying to get a little bit closer to that elusive truth. And I don't think you gain, I think the notion of the Renaissance, and if you want to be West-centric about it, if you want to argue that, yes, the West created the Renaissance on its own and therefore it created modernity on its own, it doesn't help you if the Renaissance that you're talking about is a false Renaissance that didn't really happen. You've got to start by identifying what is true about this movement before you can evaluate its place in the history of the world.
There's one example that you had, I think a couple before that, about the sort of worship of realism, perspective, and so on in painting, that it was completely realistic. And an example jumps to my mind of Piero della Francesca, who is well known as being having had deep knowledge of mathematical principles, having embraced the whole idea of scientific perspective. And in one of his greatest paintings, which coincidentally I'm going to be sending to everybody as the Benedictus Easter card in a couple of weeks' time, is his resurrection. And the group of soldiers at the base of the tomb from which Christ is rising, one of them has no legs. And yet everything else in Piero is always, by art historians, assumed to be so accurate, the golden section, perspective, and the reason he's put no legs in it, because it justly doesn't look right if that man has legs. It muddles up the composition. So just as freely as any medieval artist, he just abandons reality.
I think if you've got a doctrine of beauty which depends on intellectual constructs like mathematics, like harmony, proportion, the golden section, the way, Renaissance aesthetics of Renaissance painting are dominated by circles and symmetry, then obviously you're going to produce something that doesn't look like the real world. Whereas if you're free of that kind of dogma, you can. I mean, I was thinking when I put that slide up, I was thinking of things like in Renaissance, in Romanesque, I was thinking things like the Christ of Abbot, which was one of the most moving sculptures I've ever seen, precisely because it really does succeed even to a satiated 21st century sensibility in communicating what suffering is really like. And I think of wonderfully realistic Gothic sculptures like the facade of the Orvieto Cathedral. I mean, those guys are perfectly proportioned. I think probably more influenced by classical sculpture that the artists knew about. One can multiply these examples indefinitely. But again, I think people have underestimated realism in medieval art because they've exaggerated it in Renaissance.
Well, they're looking for a place to begin. Has anybody got a question for Felipe?
I think somebody was waving at me from the back there, unless it was to say goodbye.
Yes. Just in discussing about Islam.
Sorry, I'm approaching you not in order to inhibit you, but because I'm terribly deaf.
Okay. When you're discussing that relationship between Europe and Islam, I agree with you in lots of things, which material culture, also then lots of techniques, etc. And the visual art is strikingly different in terms of tapestries and miniature paintings. What do you see the relationship there?
Yes.
Do you see them cheating because of the religious side? Or?
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I don't think you're disagreeing with me really, because I did say it when I got to this point in the talk that even if you add up all this Islamic influence, it doesn't explain the Renaissance, because there are these original features. I mean, very obviously, in the 15th century, most Islamic art is it's not figural. It's not. So it doesn't attempt realism in any sense. In that there is figural Islamic art earlier, and there's a lot from Shiite circles in the 14th century in which you do have artists who are willing to reproduce the human body and interested in doing it realistically. But that's not true of the 15th century. So that's just one example of the sort of thing you're talking about. You're right. The influence of of Islamic art is much more in technical matters, in technological matters, because obviously the pigments and the materials, the way the clays mix in the case of ceramics, these are the things that Westerners get from Islam. And although there is, direct pictorial influence, I haven't shown you any examples, but obviously everybody knows that there's a lot of influence of Oriental textiles in painterly technique in Renaissance Italy and the Netherlands. You put all these things together, they're not in my submission. I agree with the young man who asked the question. sufficient to account for the Renaissance. These are marginal influences which help to shape Renaissance art, which don't account for the whole movement. Well, I don't know who's next. Where should I go? So.
I mean, incredible lecture, but I'm not sure what is left of in terms of the distinctive features of the Renaissance, because I completely take your point, it's not useful to just have a two-sentence definition. But at the same time, we've demolished a lot of the orthodox preconceptions about the Renaissance. So what are the defining features that remain?
Oh, I see. Well, thank you very much for saying it was incredible, by which I take it you mean you don't believe it. Obviously, a lot of these responses to conventional wisdom look very, very destructive. But I don't see them like that. I don't see them as discarding the notion of the Renaissance. I see them as clarifying. And we're still left, even if you discard all these old shibboleths, you're still left with the Renaissance, as I defined it very casually right at the beginning of the talk, as a movement of increasing intensification of the traditional search to retrieve the texts and imagery and values of classical antiquity. And that is a real phenomenon. It really does accelerate in the 14th and 15th centuries. It really does amount to almost a kind of ethos, because this idea that you can find the values that you need to lead the good life, to make you a successful ruler, to be happy, to be a great artist. You can find all those values in classical antique models. This is a powerful shaping ethos in Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries, and begins in parts of Europe in the 14th century. Well, of course, in the case of the humanist curriculum, you can find precedents in the 13th century. So these are, and of course I should mention the humanist curriculum, because clearly the rise of a curriculum of classical inspiration, which focuses on history and grammar and poetry and rhetoric and moral philosophy, also is tremendously powerful and shaping force. So I think in all of those respects, the Renaissance survives all the deconstruction, all the revisionism, and all the criticism, and it is real.
I just have, could we entertain the idea of what realism is? That it's conventionally what the eyes see, and it looks like what we all see. What does a microscope see? What does a mathematical understanding see? Could that be a component to what constitutes realism?
Well, that's a great question, because of course, one of the things that we associate with painting of this period is the use of the camera oscura, and in the 17th century, you have devices like telescopes and microscopes which do enable people to see what was previously invisible, to see a kind of reality that underlies appearance. And it's an absolutely standard notion, all these Platonic ideas that are circulating throughout the Middle Ages and are popular with some Renaissance philosophers, that there's that appearance is isn't just one form of reality. It's not reality at all. Reality is beyond perception, and it can only be attained by reason. So all of those notions are there, and of course you can see that. I always think that if you look at something like Michelangelo's Captives, I don't think Claire's much more of an expert on art history than I am, but I always think when you look at something like that, and people say, oh, well, Michelangelo ran out of time, or he couldn't be bothered to finish the whole thing. Clearly, that's not right. He's painting reality in a Platonic sense. He's showing forms emerging from the rock. So, of course, there are different ways of representing reality. But I just meant, I'm sorry, when I said that there was a lot of realism in pre-Renaissance art. I was really just thinking of, well, I think I used